Hey guys, tonight we are re-traveling back to the last days of one of history's most unstoppable men. A king who conquered the known world before turning 33, only to die suddenly, leaving everything he built, teetering on the edge of chaos. Alexander the Great's empire stretched from Greece to India, and when he died in 323 BCE, no one knew what came next. There was no plan, no heir ready to rule, and no one capable of replacing him. What followed wasn't to just a collapse. It was a slow-motion explosion that would shape the next 3 centuries of history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights. Imagine the heavy scent of incense and oil lamps flickering in a Babylonian palace, and let us step into the room where the world's greatest conqueror took his final breath. In June of 323 BCE, Babylon was the center of the world. Alexander had returned there after 8 years of campaigns that had carried his army from the Aegean to the edge of India. He was 32, undefeated in battle, master of half the known world, and already planning his next conquest, a naval expedition toward Arabia and beyond. But history had other plans. Accounts differ, as they always do when myths begin. Some say Alexander fell ill after a night of heavy drinking at a banquet held in honor of his admiral Nero. Others say he caught a fever after sailing through the marshes of the Euphrates. Within days, the man who had survived countless wounds, arrows, spears, even a chest injury that nearly killed him in India, could barely stand. His voice weakened, his body burned with fever, and his soldiers gathered outside the palace, demanding to see him one last time. When the doors opened, Alexander was carried past them on a stretcher. Too weak to speak, he raised his hand in silence, and the army that had marched across continents broke down in tears. A few days later, he was dead. The official cause, fever. Perhaps malaria or typhoid, remains uncertain. Ancient rumors spoke of poisoning, but that seems unlikely. The symptoms lasted too long. Still, the question of what killed him has never been answered. What mattered more than how he died was what he left behind, or rather, what he didn't. Alexander had no legitimate adult heir. His only son, Alexander IV, was still unborn in the womb of Roxana, his Bactrian wife. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was alive but mentally unfit to rule, for an empire stretching thousands of miles. An empire built on personal loyalty to one man, this was fatal. In the days after his death, his generals, known later as the Diadochi, or successors, gathered in the royal palace. They had marched together for more than a decade, shared battles, dangers, and triumphs. But beneath their unity lay ambition. Each commanded a part of the army, and each believed himself capable of ruling. According to one account, when asked to whom he left his empire, Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." Another version says, he said, "To Crateros," the name of a trusted general whose title also meant the strongest. Either way, the message was clear. There would be no peace. The immediate problem was practical. Who controlled the army, the treasury, the royal body? The Macedonian soldiers, fiercely loyal to Alexander's lineage, insisted that the throne belonged to his unborn child. The generals, more pragmatic, wanted control now. They appointed Perdiccas, Alexander's cavalry commander, as regent, a temporary guardian of both the unborn child and the empire itself. It was a compromise that pleased no one and satisfied nothing. In Babylon, as the summer heat rose, the greatest empire the world had ever seen began to fracture. The treasury overflowed with Persian gold, but the unity that had built it was already gone. Alexander's death was not just the end of a life, it was the spark that ignited one of history, his longest and most ruthless struggles for power. His body was placed in a gold sarcophagus filled with honey to preserve it, awaiting transport back to Macedonia. But even that journey would become a matter of politics and betrayal. For now, Babylon was silent. The greatest conqueror in history lay dead, and no one, not his generals, not his family, not even the gods he claimed descended from, could decide what came next. The empire he had built by sheer will was suddenly leaderless, a body without a heartbeat. The men who had followed him across deserts and mountains were now about to turn their swords on each other. The wars that would follow would last longer than Alexander's own life, and they would ensure that his empire, like all great dreams, would not survive him. The days following Alexander's death were chaos disguised as ceremony. In Babylon's palace, where the scent of embalming spices hung in the air, generals argued in whispers that quickly became shouts. No one knew who ruled now. Alexander had conquered an empire that stretched over 5,000 kilometers, from the Ionian coast to the Indus River. But he had built it around himself, not around institutions. Every order, every appointment, every battle plan had flowed from his mind. Without him, the empire was an intricate machine with the key removed. At first, they tried to hold it together through ritual. Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus, was proclaimed king under the name Philip III, though everyone knew he lacked the intellect to govern. His mental condition was the result of illness, not incompetence, but to the hardened generals of the Macedonian army, he was upon. Meanwhile, Roxana, the foreign queen from distant Bactria, gave birth to Alexander's posthumous son, Alexander IV. The newborn was hailed as legitimate heir, but an infant could rule nothing. The compromise was awkward. 2 kings, one incapable, one a child. Both under the guardianship of Alexander's most powerful general. As regent, he effectively controlled the empire, but his authority rested on a promise that he would rule in the name of the kings, not for himself. It was a promise no one believed he intended to keep. The rest of Alexander's companions, the Diadochi, were not men accustomed to submission. Each had commanded armies, conquered provinces, and amassed wealth and followers. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Cassander. Their names would become the foundation stones of new kingdoms. But for now, they were uneasy allies, each waiting for a chance to claim more. The first crisis came immediately. Where to bury Alexander? To Macedonians, the king's resting place was sacred. Perdiccas insisted his body should return to the royal tombs in Asia, in Macedonia, to legitimize the new order. But others saw the corpses more than a symbol. It was power incarnate. Whoever possessed Alexander's body could claim to be his true heir. It was Ptolemy, stationed in Egypt, who acted first. As the funeral procession made its slow journey west, Ptolemy intercepted it in Syria and diverted the golden sarcophagus to Memphis. Then later to Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had founded. It was both an act of reverence and theft. Egypt would now become the keeper of the conqueror's remains, and, under Ptolemy's rule, the keeper of his myth. Perdiccas saw it as treason. Furious, he prepared for war, declaring that Ptolemy had defied royal command. His reaction exposed the empire's fatal flaw. Unity had depended on Alexander's charisma, and without it, authority meant nothing. Each general held his own army, his own treasury, his own ambitions. In 322 BCE, Perdiccas began consolidating control, marrying Alexander's sister Cleopatra to strengthen his legitimacy. But ambition breeds enemies. Antipater, Craterus, and others in Macedonia opposed him. Old loyalties split. New ones formed. The empire that had taken a decade to build was unraveling within a year. To understand the scale of the problem, imagine an empire too vast to be governed even today. Deserts, mountains, river valleys, and dozens of languages. Alexander had kept it together through speed, personal authority, and a myth of invincibility. None of his successors could replicate that. The satraps, provincial governors he had appointed, were Macedonian warlords ruling over millions of Persians, Egyptians, and Greeks who owed them no natural loyalty. The empire had always been fragile. Now, it was breaking. Perdiccas' attempt to restore order failed almost immediately. In 321 BCE, he invaded Egypt to punish Ptolemy. But his army, exhausted and demoralized, mutinied on the Nile. Perdiccas was murdered by his own officers. His death ended any hope of a single regency. What followed was worse. The Wars of the Diadochi, a series of conflicts that would last for 40 years. turning Alexander's once mighty realm into a battlefield of ambition. By then, the question was no longer who would inherit the empire, but whether it could survive it all. The throne was no longer empty, it was shattered, split into pieces that no man could sit upon for long. In the heart of Babylon, Alexander's vast audience halls grew silent. The banners faded, the soldiers dispersed. What had once been the center of the world was now just another city, abandoned by the dream that had made it glow. The empire, though still rich and immense, had lost its soul, the mind that gave it purpose. The age of Alexander was over. The age of his successors had begun, men raised in his shadow, armed with his ambition, and doomed to destroy one another in their pursuit of his ghosts. By the year 323 before the Common Era, the empire Alexander had built covered more territory than any single ruler had ever controlled, a patchwork of cultures, cities, and armies, held together by his charisma alone. When that vanished, what remained was an impossible inheritance. No map could contain it, and no council could agree on how to divide it. The Macedonian generals called a meeting to decide the future of the world, a meeting later known as the Partition of Babylon. It took place in a palace, still hung with Persian silks, and smelling faintly of embalming oil from Alexander's funeral. Around the table sat the men who had marched beside him from the plains of Macedon to the banks of the Indus River. Each of them wore the scars of a dozen campaigns. Each believed he deserved more than the rest, and each, secretly, wondered whether the empire could even survive. The discussions were brutal. Some wanted a single king. Others wanted the empire split among equals. The soldiers, many of them Macedonian veterans who had followed Alexander since youth, demanded that the empire remain whole, ruled by his infant son, Alexander IV, with a regent to govern until the boy came of age. The generals, however, saw the empire as a prize, not a duty. Eventually, an agreement emerged, fragile, temporary, and doomed. The empire would stay united in name only, but its provinces would be distributed among Alexander's commanders, who would serve as satraps or governors. It was a political compromise, disguised as loyalty. In practice, it was the beginning of the end. Here's roughly how the pieces fell. Perdiccas, already serving as regent, would oversee the central administration. Ptolemy received Egypt, along with Cyprus and parts of Libya, the richest and most defensible province. Antigonus gained control over Phrygia, Lycia, and Pamphylia. In Asia Minor, Lysimachus took Thrace, guarding the empire's northern frontier. Seleucus was made commander of the elite royal cavalry, and later governor of Babylon, a post that would make him one of the most powerful men in the East. Antipater, too old to fight, but still influential, retained authority in Macedon and Greece. On paper, it was an orderly division of responsibility. In reality, it was the carving up of an empire still breathing. Each man interpreted his authority differently. The regent Perdiccas believed the others ruled in the name of the royal house. The others believed they ruled for themselves. The empire Alexander had once unified through force and vision was now a series of armed provinces, each with its own army, treasury, and agenda. The Persian system of satrapies that Alexander had adapted for his own use now became the very framework for disintegration. Meanwhile, unrest spread through the ranks. Many soldiers wanted to return home to Macedonia after years of campaigning. Others, settled in the new Greek-founded cities across Asia, feared they would be abandoned. The balance Alexander had maintained between his native Macedonians and his newly integrated Persian subjects began to collapse. In some regions, rebellions flared within months. Perdiccas tried to hold the structure together, issuing decrees in the names of the two kings, the weak half-brother Philip III and the infant Alexander IV. But each order he sent out had to travel weeks across deserts and mountains to reach men who no longer considered themselves subordinates. Power now moved faster than messages. Even as they pretended to preserve Alexander's empire, the generals began rearming against one another. Ptolemy fortified the Nile and secured Egypt's wealth. Antigonus raised troops in Asia Minor. Seleucus strengthened his hold over Babylon. Each acted as though the empire's unity were already dead, because it was. Historians later described this moment, the partition of Babylon, as the hinge between the age of conquest and the age of division. In one stroke, Alexander's dream of a single world order, a fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures under one rule, had been reduced to an uneasy truce among warlords. And yet, paradoxically, this fragmentation ensured that Greek influence spread farther than ever before. The generals took not only soldiers and gold from Babylon, but also scholars, architects, and administrators. They carried with them the blueprints of Alexander's hybrid civilization. One foot in Greece, one in Asia. Each new capital would become a seed of that vision, even as its founders fought over his ghost. By 323 before the Common Era, the empire still bore Alexander's name, but it was already something else. A collection of kingdoms, pretending to be one. The men who had sworn oaths of loyalty on his sword now drew their blades against one another. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Anatolia, the air was thick with the tension of an empire divided but not yet destroyed. The peace of Babylon was an illusion, a pause before the storm, and soon enough, that storm would break, turning the heirs of Alexander into enemies, and the empire of one man into a world of many kings. The illusion of unity did not last. Within a single year after the partition of Babylon in 323 before the Common Era, the generals who had sworn to preserve Alexander's empire as a single whole began turning their soldiers and ambitions against one another. What had started as an agreement among comrades collapsed into the first of the wars of the successors, a sprawling series of conflicts that would last nearly 4 decades and redraw the political map of the known world. At first, each warlord claimed to fight in the name of the kings, Philip III and the infant Alexander IV, but this was nothing more than theater. The reality was that the empire had become a chessboard, and every general wanted to be king. The first major confrontation came between Perdiccas, the regent of the royal family, and Ptolemy, who ruled in Egypt. Ptolemy's seizure of Alexander's body, diverting the funeral procession to Egypt instead of Macedonia, was more than a symbolic insult. It was a political declaration. In the ancient world, the resting place of a conqueror defined the center of his legacy. By claiming the corpse, Ptolemy claimed to be the guardian of Alexander's memory. Perdiccas could not let that stand. In 321 before the Common Era, he marched south from Babylon with the royal army to punish Ptolemy and reassert control. But Egypt's geography favored the defender. The Nile's channels and fortresses turned every advance into a trap. Ptolemy, an experienced general himself, avoided open battle, cutting off supply lines and using the river to isolate Perdiccas' forces. The campaign ended in disaster. Thousands drowned in the Nile trying to cross it, and Perdiccas' officers, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, mutinied and killed him. His death shattered the illusion of central authority. The regent was gone, and no one could claim to rule in the name of the royal family with any credibility. The empire now belonged to the strongest armies and the most ruthless men. The survivors met at a new conference, the partition of Triparadisus, held in Syria later that same year. There, territories were redistributed again. Antipater, the aging general in Macedonia, became regent. Antigonus, the one-eyed, was given command over Asia. Lysimachus retained Thrace. Ptolemy kept Egypt, and Seleucus was confirmed in Babylon. It was a peace agreement in name only. Each man left the meeting with more soldiers, more ambition, and less trust than before. When Antipater died in 319 before the Common Era, another power vacuum appeared. His chosen successor, Polyperchon, was challenged by Antipater's own son, Cassander, who refused to accept being passed over. Civil war broke out in Greece, drawing in the others. Polyperchon allied with Olympias, Alexander's mother, who fiercely defended her grandson's claim, but Cassander's forces crushed them both. Olympias was captured and executed in 316 before the Common Era, and the young Alexander IV, still a child, was imprisoned. Within a few years, Cassander quietly had both the boy and his mother Roxana killed. With that act, the direct bloodline of Alexander the Great ended forever. From that moment on, every general stopped pretending. They no longer fought for Alexander's heirs, but for themselves. Antigonus, the most ambitious of them all, tried to reunite the empire under his rule. Operating from his base in Asia Minor, he expanded rapidly, seizing Syria, invading Babylon, and driving Seleucus eastward. For a brief moment, it looked as though a single empire might rise again, but the others would not allow it. Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus formed an alliance against him. The First Coalition War began in 315 before the Common Era, a vast conflict stretching from Greece to Persia. These wars were unlike the campaigns of Alexander. They were not about exploration or conquests, but about inheritance. Brothers in arms turned enemies. Armies that once fought together at Ipsus and Gaugamela now met as foes. On the same battlefields, the generals recruited mercenaries, hired local soldiers, and drained treasuries. Entire cities were besieged and destroyed, their populations caught in the crossfire of ambition. Amid all this, the Greek world changed. New cities founded by Alexander, places like Alexandria in Egypt, Seleucia on the Tigris, and Antigonia in Syria, became the centers of regional power. Trade routes shifted. Persian administration mixed with Macedonian discipline. The old unity of Greece was replaced by a network of semi-independent Hellenistic kingdoms that blended Greek culture with Eastern traditions. By the time peace was signed in 311 before the Common Era, the world Alexander had known was gone. The infant king Alexander IV was still technically alive, imprisoned under Cassander's watch, but his reign was symbolic. Each of the successors now styled himself as an independent ruler, minting his own coins and raising his own dynasties. Yet, even in division, they continued to invoke Alexander's name. His image appeared on their coinage. His legend used to legitimize their authority. The man who had dreamed of a single, unified empire had become a myth used by rivals to justify disunity. When, around 310, before the Common Era, Cassander finally ordered the murder of young Alexander IV and Roxana, there was no one left with any right to the throne. The empire had no heir, no capital, no unity, only memory. The wars of the successors were far from over, but their purpose had changed forever. They were no longer fighting for Alexander's empire. They were fighting to build their own. The world had entered the Hellenistic age, an age born not in the glory of conquest, but in the ashes of ambition. The empire of Alexander was gone, but its language, its cities, and its culture were only beginning to spread. Of all Alexander's generals, none acted with more foresight than Ptolemy, son of Lagus, a calm, strategic mind in a world of impulsive conquerors. When he took control of Egypt after the partition of Babylon in 323, before the Common Era, most saw it as a distant province, rich but peripheral. Ptolemy saw something else: stability, wealth, and security. While others fought endlessly over the heartlands of the old Persian Empire, he quietly built a dynasty that would outlast them all. Egypt had always been different. Isolated by deserts, sustained by the Nile, and protected by natural barriers, it was nearly impossible to invade successfully. Its population was ancient, its agricultural system unmatched, and its cities thrived on grain exports and trade with the Mediterranean. Ptolemy understood that whoever controlled Egypt controlled the food supply of the Eastern Mediterranean, and food meant power. His first act as ruler was bold and symbolic. He seized Alexander's body. The funeral procession carrying the conqueror's embalmed remains was on its way to Macedonia, but Ptolemy intercepted it in Syria, diverting it to Egypt. There, he placed it first in Memphis, the old pharaonic capital, and later in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had founded. This was not merely reverence. In ancient politics, possession of a king's body conferred legitimacy. Ptolemy presented himself as Alexander's true heir, the guardian of his memory, not just another warlord. The act worked brilliantly. Soldiers and settlers in Egypt accepted him as the natural successor, and the presence of Alexander's tomb gave his rule divine prestige. Visitors came from across the Hellenistic world to pay tribute. Even centuries later, Roman emperors like Julius Caesar and Augustus would visit Alexander's tomb, still standing in Alexandria, long after Ptolemy's own dynasty had faded. But symbolism alone could not hold power. Ptolemy was a realist. He immediately began strengthening Egypt's defenses, building fortresses along the Nile Delta, reorganizing the fleet, and ensuring that the grain supply was tightly controlled. He encouraged Greek veterans to settle in Egypt, granting them land in return for military service. This created a loyal, Hellenized elite soldiers, administrators, and scholars who formed the backbone of his new kingdom. Unlike his rivals, Ptolemy was cautious in warfare. He fought when necessary, but avoided overextension. He defended Egypt against Perdiccas' invasion in 321 before the Common Era, defeating the region's forces and ensuring Egyptian independence. Later, he joined the coalitions against Antigonus, the one-eyed, the most ambitious of Alexander's successors, but he always withdrew when the risks grew too great. He preferred diplomacy and strategy over reckless conquest. At the same time, Ptolemy cultivated a new cultural identity. He embraced Egyptian traditions, appearing on temple walls in pharaonic garb, offering sacrifices to native gods, and adopting the title of pharaoh. But he also maintained his Macedonian roots, ruling from the newly built city of Alexandria, which quickly became the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean world. Under his reign, Alexandria blossomed. Its lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships into the harbor. The Library of Alexandria, which he and his son founded, aimed to collect every book ever written. Scholars from Greece, Persia, and India gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Figures like Euclid, Eratosthenes, and Archimedes worked under the Ptolemy's patronage. Egypt became not only a center of wealth, but also of knowledge. Meanwhile, Ptolemy's rivals exhausted themselves. Antigonus's empire in Asia Minor rose and fell. Seleucus fought in the east. Cassander struggled to hold Greece, while others gambled everything on empire-wide domination. Ptolemy consolidated quietly, turning his small corner of Alexander's world into a fortress of prosperity. By the time of the Battle of Ipsus, in 301, before the Common Era, the great showdown among the successors, Ptolemy's position was secure. He took little direct part in the fighting, preferring to guard his borders while the others destroyed each other. When the dust settled, Antigonus was dead, and his dream of reuniting the empire died with him. Ptolemy emerged as one of the last standing powers, his control over Egypt unchallenged. He ruled until around 283, before the Common Era, passing the throne peaceably to his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the first real dynastic succession among the successors. By then, he had founded a dynasty that would endure for nearly 3 centuries, through 13 kings and queens, down to the most famous of them all, Cleopatra VII, who would meet Julius Caesar and later die in the shadow of Rome's rise. In an age defined by ambition and collapse, Ptolemy's genius was restraint. Where others sought to rule everything, he was content to rule well. His Egypt became a blend of Greek and Egyptian culture, science and religion, discipline and imagination. While Alexander's other heirs bled their empires dry, Ptolemy quietly built one that endured. The tomb of Alexander still lay in Alexandria, a reminder to every visitor that even the greatest conqueror needed a guardian. And in Ptolemy's Egypt, the dream of Alexander lived on not as a world-spanning empire, but as a shining, stable kingdom beside the Nile, where Greek reason met Egyptian eternity. If Ptolemy's Egypt was the cautious heart of Alexander's fractured world, then Seleucus-I Nicator's empire was its restless frontier. Vast, volatile, and endlessly ambitious. Seleucus, whose name meant the victorious, began with almost nothing. At the time of the partition of Babylon, he was merely the commander of the royal cavalry. By the end of his life, he ruled the largest of all the successor kingdoms, a realm stretching from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of India. His story began in the chaos following Perdiccas' death in 321 before the Common Era. Seleucus had served loyally under Perdiccas, but when the regent's Egyptian campaign collapsed, he joined the mutiny that ended it. For his role, he was rewarded with control of Babylon, the empire's old capital, the beating heart of Mesopotamia. It was a dangerous gift. Babylon was both strategically crucial and fiercely contested. Antigonus, the one-eyed, the most powerful of the successors, coveted it. For a few years, Seleucus held on by cunning and compromise, fortifying the city and winning the loyalty of the local population. But in 315 before the Common Era, Antigonus demanded that Seleucus surrender Babylon to his authority. Seleucus refused and fled east to seek allies. His allies were unexpected. He turned to Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of the Mauryan Empire in India. Chandragupta had recently driven Alexander's old satraps out of India and was consolidating power, rather than wage another costly war. Seleucus negotiated around 305. Before the Common Era, the two met and struck a deal. Seleucus ceded the easternmost provincias parts of modern Afghanistan and Pakistan in exchange for 500 war elephants and a lasting peace. Those elephants would prove decisive in his later victories. With India secured and his rear protected, Seleucus turned westward. In 312, before the Common Era, he launched a daring campaign to retake Babylon. The battle that followed, known as the Babylonian War, was fought not for a city, but for legitimacy. Antigonus's forces were defeated, and Seleucus re-entered Babylon in triumph, greeted as a liberator by its citizens. The event became so significant that it marked the official founding of the Seleucid era, a new calendar that would be used across Asia for centuries. From there, Seleucus's empire expanded with astonishing speed. He reclaimed Persia, Media, and Syria, and eventually marched west to Asia Minor. His network of satraps and garrisons stretched over 4,000 kilometers, making his kingdom the largest of all the Hellenistic states. But vastness was both strength and weakness. It required constant travel, endless diplomacy, and a delicate balance between Greek settlers and local populations. Seleucus managed this complexity by founding cities, dozens of them. The most famous, Seleucia, on the Tigris, became his capital, and a deliberate replacement for Babylon, which he feared might rebel again. Designed by Greek architects and organized on a grid, it symbolized the fusion of Macedonian order and Mesopotamian wealth. Other cities, like Antioch, Laodicea, and Apamea, were named for his family members, forming a chain of Hellenistic civilization from the Aegean to the Indus. These cities were not just military bases. They were cultural bridges. Seleucus encouraged Greek veterans to settle in them, creating miniature versions of Greek life in the heart of Asia. Temples to Zeus stood beside Zoroastrian fire altars. Local artisans learned Greek techniques. Traders spoke a mixture of Greek, Aramaic, and Persian. The result was a hybrid civilization that carried Alexander's vision farther east than even he had managed. But the Seleucid Empire was not built on peace. Seleucus spent decades fighting against Antigonus, against Lysimachus, against revolts and invasions. In 301, before the Common Era, at the Battle of Ipsus, his Indian elephants helped crush Antigonus's army, finally ending the dream of reunifying Alexander's empire. Seleucus and his ally Lysimachus divided the spoils. Seleucus gained most of Asia, while Lysimachus took Thrace and western Anatolia. In his later years, Seleucus turned his gaze westward once more. By 281, before the Common Era, he had conquered nearly all of Asia Minor and was poised to cross into Macedonia, the homeland of Alexander himself, after decades of warfare. The commander who had begun as a cavalry officer now stood on the brink of ruling the land of his birth. But fate intervened. That Samiger, he was assassinated near Lysimachia by Ptolemy-Serranus, the exiled son of the Egyptian king. Seleucus died as he had lived on campaign, sword in hand, one step away from total triumph. Yet his legacy endured. The empire he founded, though often unstable, survived for nearly 2 centuries. Ruled by his descendants, it became the eastern pillar of the Hellenistic world, rivaling Ptolemaic Egypt in wealth and Rome in scale. Under Seleucid rule, Greek culture penetrated deeper into Asia than ever before. Astronomers in Babylon wrote in Greek. Coins bearing Greek gods circulated through Persia, and Greek theaters appeared in cities once ruled by Persian kings. The dream of a world united through culture, if not through empire, lived on. But the size of Seleucus's creation carried its own doom. Distance eroded control, and local dynasties slowly reasserted independence. In the Far East, the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms would eventually break away. To the west, the rising power of Rome loomed just beyond the horizon. The Seleucid Empire, like its founder, was brilliant, ambitious, and fatally Still, for a moment, brief, magnificent, and impossible to repeat, Seleucus had rebuilt Alexander's dream in his own image. An empire without boundaries, where east met west, not in battle, but in exchange. While Ptolemy fortified Egypt and Seleucus expanded eastward, one man still believed he could restore Alexander's empire in its entirety. His name was Antigonus, Monophelmus, the One-Eyed. Of all the successors, Antigonus was the oldest, the most experienced, and perhaps the most daring. He had fought beside Alexander from the earliest campaigns in Asia, and had governed parts of the empire even before the conquest was complete. When the others were dividing territories, Antigonus was already building an army large enough to claim them all. Antigonus's base was Phrygia, in the rugged heart of Anatolia, where mountains shielded him from invasion and wealth flowed from trade routes linking the Aegean and the east. From there, he watched the squabbling of his rivals Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon, Cassander in Macedonia, and Lysimachus in Thrace, and concluded that the world needed one ruler again. Not a regent, not a council, but a king. And he saw himself as that king. At first, his ambition looked achievable. In 316 before the Common Era, he defeated Umans of Cardia, one of the last generals still loyal to the royal family, and executed him. This victory gave him control over Asia Minor and most of the eastern provinces. His armies marched with banners bearing Alexander's image, and his coins carried slogans of continuity. The suggestion that he, not the others, was the true heir to the conqueror's legacy. His confidence grew quickly. He began appointing his own satraps, issuing decrees as though he were monarch of the entire empire, and even founded cities named after himself and his family, Antigonia and Syria, among others. In 314 before the Common Era, he began demanding tribute from neighboring territories, effectively declaring himself the supreme ruler of the Hellenistic world. The other generals were alarmed. They had fought each other for power, but none wanted to see one of them succeed where Alexander had fallen. In 314 before the Common Era, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Cassander, and Seleucus formed an alliance against Antigonus, beginning the First Coalition War. Antigonus's response was characteristically bold. Rather than waiting to be surrounded, he struck first. His armies swept through the Levant, retook much of Syria, and advanced toward Babylon. Seleucus fled east again, and for a time, it seemed Antigonus might actually reforge Alexander's empire under his banner. But his strength had limits. Each front required armies, and each army required gold. The more he conquered, the more fragile his control became. Meanwhile, his son Demetrius, known as the Besieger, emerged as one of the most talented commanders of the age. In 306, before the Common Era, Demetrius won a spectacular naval victory over Ptolemy's fleet near Cyprus, capturing much of the island and destroying the myth of Egyptian invincibility. To celebrate, Antigonus and Demetrius did something none of the other generals had dared. They declared themselves kings. The act was revolutionary. Until then, all of the successors had ruled under the fiction that they were merely stewards of Alexander's empire, serving in his memory. By proclaiming themselves kings, Antigonus and Demetrius openly ended that illusion. The others followed immediately. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon, Lysimachus in Thrace, Cassander in Macedonia. Within Aegir, 5 kings ruled where one had once stood. The empire of Alexander was now officially dead. For a few years, Antigonus's position looked unassailable. He held most of Asia Minor, parts of Syria, and control over the Aegean islands. His armies were disciplined and loyal, his treasury full, and his son's victories brought him prestige. But power has a way of attracting too many enemies. By 302 before the Common Era, a second grand coalition formed an alliance of almost every other major successor. Cassander marched from Greece, Lysimachus invaded from Thrace, Seleucus brought his eastern legions and Indian war elephants, and Ptolemy prepared his fleet in the south. Antigonus and Demetrius met them at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 before the Common Era, fought in the plains of Phrygia, the same land where Alexander's army had once marched east toward glory. Antigonus, now more than 80 years old, commanded the center, while Demetrius led the cavalry. At first, the battle went well. Demetrius's horsemen drove back the enemy's flank, scattering Cassander's troops. But Seleucus had brought with him the elephants he had received from Chandragupta, 500 of them, and unleashed them to block Demetrius's return. Cut off from his father, Demetrius could not regroup. The lines collapsed, surrounded and bombarded by missile fire. Antigonus was struck by a spear and fell dead. When his body was found after the battle, it was said that his single remaining eye still glared open, a final symbol of defiance. His army surrendered, and his dream of reuniting Alexander's empire died with him. The victors divided his territories among themselves. Seleucus took Syria and much of the east. Lysimachus gained control of western Anatolia. Cassander kept Macedon and Greece, and Ptolemy secured Cyprus and the southern coast. Antigonus's death marked a turning point. No one ever again tried to reunite Alexander's empire. The successors had proven that it could not be done. The vastness of the territories, the diversity of peoples, and the ambition of the rulers made unity impossible. Instead, the world entered a new era, one of stable, rival kingdoms, each blending Greek influence with local traditions. Yet Antigonus's legacy endured in his son. Demetrius continued to fight, briefly seizing the Macedonian throne before losing it again. His descendants, the Antigonid dynasty, would rule Macedon for nearly a century until the rise of Rome. In a sense, Antigonus's failure defined the next stage. His ambition to restore the empire ended in blood, but it also forced his rivals to formalize their kingdoms and create lasting institutions. The dream of unity was gone, but the framework of the Hellenistic world, a mosaic of monarchies born from Alexander's shadow, had begun to take shape. The Battle of Ipsus, fought in 301 before the Common Era, marked the final collapse of Alexander's empire as a single entity. It was not merely a contest of kings, but the moment when ambition, fatigue, and geography conspired to scatter what had once been the most unified realm in history. The battle was fought on the high plains of Phrygia, in the center of Anatolia, the same land where Alexander's army had begun its march toward Persia 3 decades earlier. Beti's point, only one man still dreamed of restoring the empire: Antigonus. He was in his early 80s, a survivor of every campaign since the invasion of Asia. Still formidable, still commanding armies younger than his grandchildren. His son Demetrius, known for his charm and audacity, fought at his side. Together they had built a powerful force, tens of thousands of Macedonian veterans, mercenaries, and local levies. Perhaps 100,000 men in all, but against them stood nearly all of the other successors, united for once, not by friendship, but by fear. Lysimachus advanced from Thrace. Cassander sent troops from Macedonia. Seleucus marched from the east with his massive army and 500 war elephants, obtained from his alliance with Chandragupta in India, and Ptolemy hovered near the southern border ready to strike if fortune favored him. The old empire had become a circle of predators, and Antigonus stood in its center. As dawn broke over the Phrygian plain, dust hung in the air, and the sound of marching feet rolled like thunder. The scale of the battle was immense, one of the largest fought since Alexander's time. Antigonus commanded the center with his infantry phalanx, their long sarissas bristling like a wall of iron, while Demetrius led the cavalry on the right flank. Facing them were Seleucus's eastern veterans, battle-hardened and disciplined, backed by the elephants that loomed like living fortresses. At first, everything went according to Antigonus's plan. Demetrius, leading the cavalry charge, smashed through the enemy's left wing with overwhelming force. The enemy lines buckled, and for a moment, victory seemed within reach. But the battlefield was vast, and Demetrius's pursuit carried him too far from the center. Seleucus saw the opening. He ordered his elephants to move forward, not against the enemy, but to block Demetrius's return. It was a masterstroke. Hundreds of elephants, forming a living barrier, filled the space between the cavalry and the main army. The dust, the trumpeting, and the chaos created total confusion. Demetrius's cavalry, trapped on the wrong side of the field, could not break through to rejoin their father. In the center, Antigonus watched helplessly as the wings of his army collapsed inward under pressure. The final assault came from Seleucus's infantry, advancing behind a wall of elephants. Arrows and stones rained down. The Macedonian phalanx, exhausted and surrounded, began to break. Antigonus, still on horseback, refused to flee. When a messenger urged him to withdraw, he reportedly replied, "If I must die, let it be here." Moments later, he was struck by a spear and fell. The old general's death ended the battle as surely as it ended his dream. When the fighting stopped, the plain of Ipsus was carpeted with bodies and broken pikes. Antigonus's army surrendered, and the victors gathered to divide his lands. Seleucus took control of Syria and much of the eastern territories, greatly expanding his already vast empire. Lysimachus claimed most of Asia Minor. Cassander retained Macedon and Greece, and Ptolemy, though he had arrived too late to fight, secured the coastal regions of southern Syria and Cyprus. The outcome of Ipsus changed the map of the ancient world permanently. No one would ever again control Alexander's empire as a single whole. Instead, three dominant kingdoms emerged. The Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece, ruled later by Demetrius' descendants. The Seleucid Empire, stretching from the Aegean to the borders of India. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, rich, stable, and culturally vibrant. This estates, along with smaller powers like Lysimachus's, Thrace, and later Pergamon, formed what historians call the Hellenistic world, a web of Greek-influenced monarchies, bound more by culture than by politics. The consequences of Ipsus reached far beyond the battlefield. The soldiers who had once marched together under Alexander now settled in different corners of the world, becoming citizens of new Greek cities founded by the victors. Trade routes shifted, connecting the Mediterranean with the Near East more closely than ever before. Greek art, language, and architecture spread into every territory touched by Macedonian arms. The world had become permanently hybrid, Greek in spirit, but vast and diverse in form. In Babylon, Greek astronomers learned from Mesopotamian scholars. In Egypt, Greek mathematicians studied under priests of the Nile. In the East, Greek settlers married local women and built cities whose coins bore both Greek gods and Persian symbols. And yet, even as the successors carved the world into pieces, they never escaped Alexander's shadow. Every one of them minted coins bearing his face. Every one of them claimed to act in his legacy. Even as they fought each other to the death, his image united them in ambition. The empire was gone, but the idea of Alexander, the young king who had once stood on this same soil and believed the world could be won, lived on. The Battle of Ipsus ended the age of conquest and began the age of inheritance. From this moment onward, the Hellenistic kingdoms would define the next 3 centuries of history until a new power, still small and provincial in the West, began to resay. That power was Rome. For now, though, the dust of Ipsus had settled, and the greatest experiment in unity the world had ever known lay in ruins, scattered by elephants, ambition, and time. After the Battle of Ipsus, in 301, before the Common Era, the ancient world entered a new chapter, one of kings rather than conquerors, of cities rather than campaigns. The dream of a single world under one ruler was gone, but something else emerged in its place. The Hellenistic kingdoms, a mosaic of monarchies that spread Greek culture across continents. They were born from war, but they built an age of learning, trade, and transformation unlike anything the world had seen before. From the wreckage of Alexander's empire rose 3 great powers that would dominate the next 2 centuries. The Antigonid kingdom in Macedon and Greece, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire in Asia. Each carried a piece of Alexander's legacy, and each reshaped it in its own way. In the West, Macedon, the homeland of Alexander, passed into the hands of his successors in the Antigonid dynasty. After the death of Antigonus, the one-eyed, his son Demetrius briefly seized control of Macedon, only to lose it again to rivals. But his descendants, through persistence and political skill, restored stability. By the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Antigonids ruled firmly from Peloponnesus, maintaining the traditions of Macedonian kingship and overseeing Greece through alliances and garrisons. They revived the old festivals, funded temples, and portrayed themselves as protectors of Greek freedom, though in truth, most Greek cities remained under their control. To the south, the Ptolemies transformed Egypt into the wealthiest kingdom of the Mediterranean. Ptolemy, the first successors, blended Greek rationalism with Egyptian divinity. The king was both pharaoh and strategist, human and god. The city of Alexandria, which Alexander had founded on the Nile Delta, became their crown jewel, a metropolis of marble palaces, libraries, and lighthouses. Its population was a mix of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and traders from as far as India. The Library of Alexandria gathered scrolls from every civilization, while the museum, a kind of early research institute, attracted mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt's wealth came from grain, papyrus, and trade. The Nile's predictable floods sustained agriculture, and the royal bureaucracy taxed it with ruthless efficiency. Egyptian priests continued their rituals under Greek oversight, while Greek settlers governed the cities. The fusion of cultures produced a society both hierarchical and vibrant: Greek on the surface, Egyptian at its roots. To the east, the Seleucid Empire dwarfed all others in size. Stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, it was an empire of distances. Seleucus I and his successors ruled from multiple capitals: Seleucia on the Tigris, Antioch, and later Ecbatana, each symbolizing a different part of their domain. They governed through a mix of Greek colonists and local elites, maintaining a delicate balance between Hellenic and Eastern traditions. The Seleucids built roads, founded new cities, and fostered trade along the routes that would later become the Silk Road. Caravans moved between the Mediterranean, Persia, and India, carrying spices, textiles, and ideas. Greek became the common language of commerce, diplomacy, and science. In Babylon, Greek astronomers studied cuneiform star charts. In Bactria, Greek coins bore the image of Zeus on one side and local deities on the other. The Hellenistic world, as modern historians call it, was defined by this blend. For the first time, the Mediterranean and Asia were part of a single cultural network. Greek architecture appeared in Syria, Greek theaters in Iran, and Greek schools in Egypt. Yet the flow of influence went both ways. Eastern luxury, philosophy, and religion transformed Greek tastes. Ivory carvings from India, spices from Arabia, and silk from the Far East entered Greek markets. The gods themselves began to merge. Zeus took on the traits of the Persian Ahura Mazda, and Isis became popular in Greece as a universal mother figure. Politically, the kingdoms were competitive but stable. Diplomacy replaced the endless wars of the successors. Dynastic marriages connected courts from Macedon to Babylon. The Ptolemies and Seleucids fought occasionally, most famously over Silla, the rich strip of land between Egypt and Mesopotamia. But trade and cultural exchange continued even in times of tension. Cities were the lifeblood of this world. Each kingdom was dotted with new urban centers: Antioch, Pergamon, Ephesus, Rhodes, Alexandria, and countless others. These cities served as administrative hubs, military bases, and centers of learning. They were cosmopolitan, filled with Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Jews, and others living side by side. In them, one could hear dozens of languages and find temples to gods from across the known world. Art and science flourished. Sculptors developed new techniques to depict emotion and realism. The Laocoon group and the winged victory of Samothrace are legacies of this era. Mathematicians like Euclid wrote the elements, the foundation of geometry. Astronomers like Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus. The physician Araphilos studied human anatomy in Alexandria, dissecting corpses to understand the nervous system. And yet, beneath the brilliance, the fragility remained. The Hellenistic kingdoms were rich but fragmented. Their power rested on strong rulers and disciplined armies. When those failed, chaos returned. Revolts were common, as native populations resisted Greek dominance. In the east, provinces like Bactria began to drift away from Seleucid control, forming independent Greek kingdoms that would later reach as far as India. But for nearly 2 centuries, the Hellenistic world thrived, a patchwork empire united not by force, but by culture. It was a world of trade routes instead of conquests, of scholars instead of generals. The Greek language became the passport of civilization, spoken from the Nile to the Hindu Kush. Even Rome, still a young republic in the West, would one day learn from its art, science, and state. Alexander's empire had died at Ipsus. But in its ashes bloomed something greater, a shared civilization that blended East and West, reason and religion, ambition and artistry. It was not the empire he had envisioned, but it was the world he had made possible. By the 3rd century, before the Common Era, something extraordinary had happened. The empire Alexander built was gone, yet its language, art, and ideas had taken on a life of their own, spreading across 3 continents, far beyond the reach of any one king. For the first time in history, a single culture, Greek culture, connected people from Spain to Afghanistan, from Egypt to the Caspian Sea. Historians call it the Hellenistic Age, but to those who lived it, it simply felt like the modern world. Greek had become the lingua franca of the ancient world. It was the language of government, philosophy, trade, and science. In Alexandria's bustling harbor, sailors from Rhodes haggled with Phoenician merchants in Greek. In Babylon, tax collectors recorded transactions in Greek alongside cuneiform. Even Jewish scholars in Jerusalem translated their scriptures into Greek, a version known as the Septuagint, so their diaspora communities could understand them. Everywhere Alexander's armies had marched, cities sprung up, each a miniature Greece in foreign lands. Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Seleucia on the Tigris, Pergamon in Asia Minor, and Ai Khanum in faraway Bactria, all shared a similar design. A grid of streets, a central marketplace, the agora, theater, and temples of the Olympian gods. These cities became islands of Hellenic civilization, surrounded by local cultures that gradually blended with them. The result was not colonization, but fusion. Greek settlers married local families, adopted local customs, and borrowed foreign ideas. In the East, Greek artisans carved Buddha-like figures in Hellenic style. In Egypt, Ptolemaic queens portrayed themselves as both Greek goddesses and Egyptian pharaohs. Even coins reflected this merging of worlds. Zeus appeared beside Persian fire symbols. Athena shared space with Egyptian crowns. The spread of education was one of the most powerful legacies of this age. The successors, especially the Ptolemies and Seleucids, sponsored vast institutions dedicated to learning. In Alexandria, the royal library was said to hold more than 500,000 scrolls, an attempt to gather all human knowledge in one place. There, scholars like Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy. Euclid refined the laws of geometry, and Archimedes, though based in Syracuse, exchanged letters and theories that reached Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Meanwhile, in Pergamon, another great library rose to rival Alexandria's, filled with books written not on papyrus, but on parchment, a new material that would shape the future of writing. In these libraries, scientists, poets, and philosophers debated everything from astronomy to politics. It was a world of rational inquiry and intellectual competition that would later inspire both the Roman world and the Islamic Golden Age. But the Hellenistic influence went beyond scholarship. It changed daily life. Greek became the language of fashion, theater, and taste. Wealthy families across Asia adopted Greek clothing, flowing chitons and cloaks, and decorated their homes with mosaics depicting scenes from Homer. Theaters were built even in distant cities like Ai, Khanum, and Maracanda, where plays by Euripides and Menander were performed before audiences who spoke dozens of languages. Religion, too, transformed. The Greek gods did not replace local deities. They merged with them. Zeus was worshipped alongside the Egyptian god Amun. As Zeus-Amun, the goddess Isis, once purely Egyptian, spread across the Mediterranean. As a universal mother figure, worshipped in Greece, Syria, and even later in Rome. Greek temples appeared in Persian lands, while Eastern mystery cults made their way into Greek cities. The Hellenistic world was not unified by rule. It was unified by imagination. Art reflected this new diversity. The heroic perfection of classical Greek sculpture gave way to realism, to emotion, movement, and imperfection. Artists carved wrinkled faces, laughing children, and ordinary workers with the same care once reserved for gods. The winged victory of Samothrace, poised on the prow of a ship, and the Laocoon group, capturing agony in marble, both came from this era of expressive genius. In literature, poets like Theocritus and Callimachus moved away from grand epics and toward personal, emotional themes. Love, longing, and everyday life. The world had grown bigger, but also more human. The tragedies of kings and the struggles of ordinary people now shared the same stage. Even science and philosophy reflected this global outlook. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium in this period, taught that all people were part of a single world community. A radical idea born directly from the experience of the Hellenistic age. The Epicureans, followers of Epicurus, emphasized reason, balance, and peace of mind in a turbulent political world. Both philosophies would influence Roman thought for centuries. The economies of these kingdoms also intertwined. Trade routes flourished, land caravans moved through Persia and Bactria, while ships sailed the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Goods from India and Arabia reached Greek markets. Greek wine and olive oil flowed eastward. Coins bearing Greek inscriptions circulated in regions that had never heard of Macedon before Alexander's time. For the first time, commerce connected east and west as parts of a single economic world. Yet, beneath all this brilliance, there remained a sense of transience. The unity was cultural, not political. The kings competed for prestige, sponsoring temples, festivals, and libraries to prove their greatness. Their wealth depended on fragile networks of trade and loyalty. When one ruler weakened, revolts followed. In some regions, resentment against foreign elites grew quietly, particularly among native populations who felt excluded from power. Still, for almost 2 centuries, the Hellenistic world thrived. It was a civilization of remarkable openness, one where a Greek architect could design temples in Egypt, where a Babylonian priest could discuss astronomy with a philosopher from Athens, where travelers could cross 3,000 kilometers and still be understood in Greek. It was, in many ways, the first version of globalization born from war, but sustained by culture. And though the political structures would one day crumble, the cultural unity they forged would never fully fade. Long after the kingdoms themselves fell, their cities endured. Alexandria remained a beacon of learning. Antioch, a crossroads of faith, and the Greek language, the vessel of thought for empires yet unborn. Even the Romans, who would conquer this world, would learn to call themselves heirs to its wisdom. Alexander's sword had carved borders, but his language, his cities, and his ideas had erased them. The empire had died, yet in its death, it achieved a kind of immortality, while the great Hellenistic kingdoms of Egypt, Macedon, and Syria shaped the western half of Alexander's old empire. The Far Eastern territories took on a quieter, stranger afterlife, one that few Greeks in the Mediterranean even knew existed. Here, on the edges of the known world, Greek settlers and local rulers built a civilization that was neither fully Greek nor fully Asian, but something entirely new. This was the world of Bactria and the Indo-Greek kingdoms, where the last echoes of Alexander's march mingled with the rhythm of India and Central Asia. After I traded his eastern provinces to Chandragupta Maurya, around 305 before the Common Era. Those distant regions, in modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and northern Pakistan, remained loosely tied to the Seleucid Empire. They were garrisoned by Greek veterans, many of whom had settled there after Alexander's campaigns. Over the generations, their cities, Ai Khanum, Bactra, Marakanda, developed into thriving Hellenistic centers. Greek theaters rose beside Persian fortresses. Gymnasiums stood near Zoroastrian fire temples. Here, the Greek and the Eastern worlds did not merely meet. They fused. AI Canum, discovered in the 20th century near the Oxyus River, gives us a vivid glimpse into this lost world. Its streets were laid out on a perfect grid, with colonnaded houses, a gymnasium, and even an inscription advising citizens in the spirit of Delphi as wisdom. As a child, learn good manners. As a young man, learn to control your passions. In old age, be of good counsel. Yet its walls were built of mud brick. Its architecture adapted to the Central Asian climate, and its coins bore both Greek and local symbols. A Greek might have called it home, but it was a long way from Athens. By the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Seleucid Empire had grown too vast to govern effectively. Rebellions flared in its eastern. Around 250 before the Common Era, one of the governors, Diodotus, declared independence, founding the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Greek rule in Central Asia had become self-sustaining, a distant branch that no longer needed the trunk. The Greco-Bactrians quickly expanded east and south, becoming one of the wealthiest Hellenistic states. Their silver coins, bearing lifelike portraits and inscriptions in Greek, circulated across trade routes reaching India and China. The real turning point came when Demetrius I, a later Greco-Bactrian king, invaded northern India around 180 before the Common Era. His armies crossed the Hindu Kush and established Greek rule in parts of the Punjab and the Indus Valley, creating the first Indo-Greek kingdoms. For more than a century, Greek kings ruled in India, a fact almost forgotten in the West, but vividly remembered in Indian art and literature. The Indo-Greek rulers adopted both Greek and Indian customs. Their coins bore Greek inscriptions on one side and Prakrit, or Korosti, script on the other. Some portrayed themselves wearing the Greek diadem. Others adopted Indian titles like Maharaja. Temples, mixed architectural styles. Corinthian columns beside Buddhist stupas. The Greek god Zeus appeared alongside Indian deities, sometimes transformed into local forms. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of this fusion was religious and artistic. Greek artists in these regions began carving statues of the Buddha, the first anthropomorphic depictions in history. Before this time, Buddhist art had avoided representing the Buddha as a person, symbolizing him instead through footprints or sacred trees. Under Greek influence, the Buddha gained a human form, serene, symmetrical, draped in flowing robes, reminiscent of Greek sculpture. This style, known as Greco-Buddhist art, spread through Asia for centuries, shaping the way the Buddha would be portrayed from India to Japan. Philosophical exchange followed the same pattern. Greek ideas of logic and ethics mingled with Indian traditions of meditation and metaphysics. Some scholars suggest that early Buddhist schools in Gandhara adopted elements of Greek philosophical reasoning, the art of structured debate and rational argument. Greek settlers, in turn, encountered ideas of karma and rebirth for the first time, expanding the spiritual horizons of Hellenism itself. Trade connected these Eastern Greek kingdoms to a wider world. From Bactria, caravans moved east to China and south to India, carrying textiles, glassware, and metalwork. In return came spices, ivory, and precious stones. The roads they traveled would later form part of what we now call the Silk Road. In this sense, Alexander's empire, though long gone, had laid the foundations for centuries of transcontinental exchange. But the Greco-Bactrian world was as fragile as it was vibrant. Its wealth and isolation made it a target for nomadic invasions. Around 130 before the Common Era, waves of Central Asian tribes, the Usi and Soka, swept across Bactria, destroying its cities. Some Greek communities fled south into India, where the Indo-Greek kingdoms lingered for another century, gradually absorbed by local dynasties. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the last Greek king of India, Strato II, disappeared from history. Yet the legacy of this forgotten frontier endured. The fusion of Greek art with Indian religion shaped Buddhist iconography across Asia. Greek scientific texts translated into Sanskrit influenced later astronomy. Even in China, Stories of Dida, USC, the descendants of Bactria's Greek-speaking settlers, survived for centuries. The eastern half of Alexander's dream had outlasted its creator not as a political empire, but as a cultural current, flowing quietly through the trade routes and philosophies of Asia. The marble columns had crumbled, but the ideas they carried kept traveling, reshaped by every hand they passed through. By the time Rome rose in the west, few remembered that Greek kings had once ruled beyond the Himalayas, but the echoes of their presence remained in art, in thought, and in the faint thread of Greek words preserved in the languages of Central Asia. Alexander had reached the edge of the world. His followers, and their descendants, went farther still, building a civilization that stretched beyond the horizon and disappeared into myth. By the 2nd century, before the Common Era, the three great Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemaic, the Seleucid, and the Antigonid, had carved up Alexander's legacy into a kind of uneasy balance. The wars that had defined the early years of the successors gave way to diplomacy, dynastic marriages, and the quieter contests of wealth and prestige. For the first time since Alexander's death, there was something resembling peace. Yet this peace was fragile, held together not by loyalty or stability, but by exhaustion and ambition, carefully disguised as civility. The Hellenistic monarchs ruled as absolute kings, but they were no longer conquerors. They were administrators, patrons, and symbols. The new kind of ruler that the ancient world had never known before. Each kingdom had its own character. In Macedonia and Greece, the Antigonid dynasty restored order after decades of chaos. The capital, Pella, once again became the center of Macedonian life. The Antigonid kings maintained control over Greece through alliances and garrisons, presenting themselves as guardians of Greek freedom while quietly suppressing rebellions. The old city-states, once fiercely independent, now existed under royal protection. Athens still held philosophical schools. Sparta still drilled its soldiers, but neither could change the course of history. Greek independence, once Alexander's starting point, had become a memory. To the south, Ptolemaic Egypt remained a world apart. Wealthy, bureaucratic, and orderly, its kings had perfected the art of balancing Greek and Egyptian traditions. The pharaoh was both divine and approachable, both Macedonian and native. The temples of Luxor and Philae were still active. Priests still performed ancient rites, and hieroglyphs still adorned the walls. But now, the inscriptions included Greek dedications alongside them. The state's power rested on agriculture, taxation, and the ability to feed the Mediterranean world with Egyptian grain. Alexandria continued to thrive as a hub of commerce and scholarship, its lighthouse guiding ships that carried wheat, papyrus, and knowledge to every corner of the known world. The Seleucid Empire, however, was too large for peace to last. It stretched from the Aegean to the borders of India, a realm that required both military strength and endless diplomacy to hold together. Its kings, from Antiochus I to Antiochus III, spent most of their reigns traveling between cities, putting down rebellions, negotiating with local dynasts, and maintaining the illusion of unity. The empire's diversity, Greek, Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, and Indian, was both its strength and its undoing. The Seleucids faced constant pressure from the Ptolemies in the south and from the rising Parthian tribes in the east. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Syrian Wars erupted, a series of 6 major conflicts fought mostly between the Seleucids and Ptolemies over control of Cilicia, a narrow strip of land that included parts of modern Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. The wars dragged on for more than a century, draining both empires of money and manpower. Meanwhile, in the west, the Antigonids struggled to maintain influence over Greece as new powers began to rise. The once mighty city-states had reorganized themselves into leagues, the Aetolian League and the Achaean League, small federations that tried to preserve autonomy through cooperation. These leagues became the last flickers of democratic spirit in an age of kings, but they too were drawn into the web of royal politics. To maintain peace, the Hellenistic monarchs relied on dynastic marriages. Daughters of kings became bargaining chips in the game of empire. The Ptolemies and Seleucids intermarried repeatedly, sometimes uniting briefly, more often fueling new rivalries. The practice of sibling marriage among the Ptolemies, adopted from Egyptian tradition, shocked the Greek world but reinforced their divine status as living gods. Ptolemy II and his sister wife, Arsinoe II, were worshipped as Philadelphoi, the sibling-loving deities. The blending of religion and monarchy reached its height here. Politics itself had become a sacred performance. Cultural competition replaced military conquest. The kings sponsored libraries, temples, and festivals to display their wealth and refinement. Antiochus III rebuilt Antioch into a glittering capital. The Ptolemies expanded the Library of Alexandria and hosted philosophical debates. The Antigonids funded great athletic games in the spirit of Olympia. To rule was to impress, to prove through magnificence that the gods favored your dynasty. But beneath this glittering surface, cracks widened. The Seleucid Empire began to lose its eastern provinces to local powers like the Parthians and Greco-Bat. The Ptolemies grew complacent, relying too heavily on foreign mercenaries to defend Egypt. In Greece, resentment of Macedonian control, the peace of the Hellenistic world, depended on strong kings. When those kings weakened, everything trembled. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, a new force was stirring in the west, a republic that had slowly conquered Italy, crushed Carthage, and was now turning its gaze across the Aegean. Rome, once a minor city-state, had become an empire in all but name. The Hellenistic kings at first underestimated it, seeing Rome as a distant curiosity, a land of farmers and soldiers. They would soon discover their mistake. In 197 before the Common Era, Philip V of Macedon faced the Romans in the Second Macedonian War and lost. 2 decades later, Antiochus III, the Great, clashed with Rome in Asia Minor and was defeated at Magnesia. His defeat forced the Seleucids to surrender Asia Minor to Rome as allies and pay a crushing indemnity. The Roman Republic had entered the Greek world, and it would never leave. Even as their political power waned, the cultural prestige of the Hellenistic kingdoms remained. Greek art, philosophy, and science continued to dominate the intellectual life of the Mediterranean. Roman generals collected Greek sculptures. Roman senators studied Greek rhetoric. The conquerors became the students of those they conquered. The fragile peace that had followed Ipsus lasted almost a century and a half, but it was a peace built on shifting sands. The kings ruled magnificently, but not wisely. Their courts glittered even as their armies grew weak. They had inherited the world of Alexander, but not his discipline, his vision, or his unity. As the 2nd century before the Common Era drew to a close, the pattern that had once broken Alexander's empire began to repeat itself. Too much wealth, too little cohesion, and too many rivals. The next century would belong to Rome, but the Hellenistic age would leave a legacy that even Rome could not erase. By the middle of the 2nd century, before the Common Era, the balance that had defined the Hellenistic world was breaking. For nearly 200 years, the kingdoms of Alexander's successors had ruled the eastern Mediterranean with splendor and ambition. But now, from the west, a new power was arriving, one that spoke Latin, not Greek, one that built not palaces, but legions. That power was Rome. At first, the Romans seemed uninterested in the Greek East. They had spent the early centuries of their rise fighting wars within Italy, then destroying Carthage in the west during the Punic Wars. But as soon as Carthage fell, Rome's attention turned toward the Aegean. The Roman Senate declared its campaigns in Greece to be liberations. They claimed to be freeing the Greek cities from Macedonian and Seleucid tyranny. In reality, Rome was building an empire of its own. The first test came in Macedon. The Antigonid dynasty, which had ruled the homeland of Alexander for over a century, found itself trapped between ambition and necessity. Philip V of Macedon tried to expand his power into the Aegean, clashing with Rhodes and Pergamon, both Roman allies. Rome intervened, claiming to protect the freedom of the Greeks. In 197 before the Common Era, at the Battle of Cynocephaly, Philip's famous phalanx met the Roman legion for the first time. The difference was devastating. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long pikes and rigid formation, had dominated battlefields for centuries, but against Rome's flexible, manipular legions, it faltered. The Romans exploited gaps in the line, attacking from the flanks. The phalanx broke, and the Macedonian army was destroyed. Philip surrendered, and the Roman general Titus Quincus Flamininus declared Greece free. The words sounded noble, but they meant Roman oversight. 2 decades later, Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, known as the Great, made the same mistake. He saw Rome's withdrawal from Greece as a sign of weakness, and tried to fill the vacuum. In 192 before the Common Era, he crossed into Greece, claiming to defend the Greeks' independence from Rome. The result was disaster. The Romans pursued him into Asia Minor and defeated him decisively at the Battle of Magnesia in 190. Before the Common Era, the Treaty of Apamea that followed was humiliating. The Seleucids were forced to surrender all their territories west of the Taurus Mountains, pay an enormous indemnity, and hand over their war elephants and fleet. The old empire of Seleucus, once the largest in the world, was now a shadow of itself. Rome did not annex these lands directly. Instead, it gave them to its allies, Pergamon and Rhodes, turning them into buffers of Roman influence. In 168 before the Common Era, the last Macedonian king, Perseus, made one final attempt to resist Roman power. His defeat at the Battle of Pydna ended Macedonian independence forever. The disciplined Roman legions crushed the phalanx once more, and Macedon was divided into 4 client republics. By 148 before the Common Era, it was absorbed entirely as a Roman province. Greece, though still full of proud cities, could not escape the same fate. Rebellions flared periodically, most notably the Achaean War in 146 before the Common Era, when Corinth defied Roman authority. The Roman general Lucius Mummius captured the city, burned it to the ground, and sent its treasures to Rome. The same year, Roman forces destroyed Carthage in the west. The message was unmistakable. Rome now ruled the Mediterranean. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, held out longest. Its wealth and natural defenses delayed Roman interference, but the Ptolemies' internal struggles weakened them. The royal family's habit of intermarriage produced endless rivalries and assassinations. Kings and queens plotted against each other, and the great library of Alexandria became more a tool of propaganda than of learning. The once great dynasty that Ptolemy I had founded degenerated into court intrigue and decadence. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Egypt's survival depended on diplomacy. The Ptolemies paid Rome for protection, sending grain to feed the Roman populace and gifts to please senators. This uneasy arrangement lasted until the reign of Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies, a queen who would try, for a brief moment, to restore her kingdom's independence through wit, charisma, and alliances with Rome's most powerful men. For the Seleucids, the end came even sooner. After Antiochus III's defeat, the empire fragmented. Parthia rose in the east, seizing Iran and Mesopotamia, while local governors in the west broke away. By the time Pompey the Great marched east in 64 before the Common Era, the Seleucid dynasty was a hollow shell. Pompey entered Syria without resistance and declared it a Roman province. The empire that had once stretched to India vanished from the map. Culturally, however, Greece triumphed, even as it fell. Roman generals looted Greek art, but also revered it. Roman aristocrats learned Greek philosophy and rhetoric, sending their sons to study in Athens. The poet Horace would later write, "Greece, though captured her fierce conqueror. Rome ruled the world, but Greece ruled Rome's mind." Greek architects built Roman temples. Greek sculptors filled Roman villas. Greek teachers trained Roman politicians. The very language of science, medicine, and philosophy remained Greek. Even the gods merged Jupiter with Zeus, Mars with Ares, Venus with Aphrodite. By the time of Julius Caesar, Greek culture was so deeply woven into Roman life that the two civilizations were inseparable. The Hellenistic world had not ended. It had simply been absorbed. The Greek cities, once symbols of freedom, now flourished as provincial jewels of a vast new empire. Rome's rise did not erase Alexander's world. It completed it. The dream of a united world under one power, which Alexander had pursued through conquest, was finally realized by Rome, though by very different means. The roads, the cities, the shared language, all of it had been laid down by the Hellenistic age. Rome inherited not a broken world, but a connected one. The empires of Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus had vanished, but their creation, the blending of East and West, endured. The spirit of the Hellenistic world would live on in Rome, Byzantium, and even the Islamic caliphates centuries later. It had begun with a Macedonian king who crossed into Asia, and ended with Rome ruling both sides of the sea. He had once dreamed of uniting. By the 1st century, before the Common Era. Nearly every kingdom born from Alexander's empire had fallen under Roman control. Only one remained: Egypt, the jewel of the ancient world. For nearly 3 centuries, the descendants of Ptolemy I Sota had ruled it, turning the Nile into the foundation of one of the richest states on earth. But by the time Cleopatra VII took the throne in 51 before the Common Era, the Ptolemaic dynasty was a shadow of its former self. Intrigue, debt, and dependence on Rome had hollowed it out from within. Cleopatra inherited a kingdom drowning in political chaos. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, had maintained power by bribing Roman senators with Egyptian gold. When Ediadi left behind a fragile alliance with Rome and a royal family at war with itself, Cleopatra, barely 18, was supposed to co-rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, but, like most of her ancestors, she had little interest in sharing power. What made Cleopatra remarkable was not her beauty. Despite the myths, ancient coins show a sharp-featured, intelligent woman. But her brilliance: she spoke multiple languages, including Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, and Aramaic, making her the first Ptolemy to master the native tongue of her people. She understood politics, economics, and propaganda. Above all, she understood that Egypt's survival depended on navigating Rome's growing dominance. In 48 before the Common Era, fate brought her the opportunity of a lifetime. Civil war had erupted in Rome between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for sanctuary, but Ptolemy XIII's advisors, eager to please Caesar, murdered him on arrival and presented his severed head as a gift. Caesar was horrified. When he arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra saw her chance. According to ancient sources, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up inside a carpet or linen sack. The image, half legend, half strategy, captured everything about her style: theatrical, bold, and perfectly timed. Caesar was captivated. Within days, he restored her to the throne, defeating her brother's forces in the Battle of the Nile. Ptolemy XIII drowned while fleeing, and Cleopatra emerged as queen once more. Her alliance with Caesar was both political and personal. Together they sailed down the Nile, visiting temples and cities in royal procession. Cleopatra presented herself as Isis reborn, the living goddess of Egypt, while Caesar's presence gave her divine legitimacy. In 47, before the Common Era, she gave birth to a son, Caesarion, whom she claimed was Caesar's child. For Egypt, this partnership brought temporary stability. The economy revived, trade flourished, and the temples once again overflowed with offerings. Alexandria regained its place as a center of learning and luxury, but the peace could not last. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 before the Common Era, Cleopatra lost her most powerful ally. She returned to Egypt, leaving Rome to tear itself apart in civil war once again. The next figure to rise from the chaos was Mark Antony, Caesar's former general and a member of the Second Triumvirate. In 41 before the Common Era, Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus. In Asia Minor, her arrival became legend. She sailed up the river on a golden barge, dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by musicians, incense, and servants with silver oars. Antony, veteran of dozens of campaigns, was stunned. The two quickly became partners, politically, romantically, and symbolically. Cleopatra offered Egypt's wealth to support Antony's ambitions. Antony offered Roman protection in return. They had 3 children and styled themselves as the rulers of the Eastern world, reviving the grandeur of Alexander's empire. Antony even presented himself as a new Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, while Cleopatra was worshipped as Isis. To their followers, it looked like the rebirth of a golden age. To Rome, it looked like treason. Their rival, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and future Emperor Augustus, used their relationship to destroy them politically. He portrayed Cleopatra as a manipulative foreign queen who had bewitched Antony and turned him against Rome. The Senate declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. A clever move that made the conflict appear like a patriotic crusade rather than another civil war. In 31 before the Common Era, their fate was sealed at the Battle of Actium off the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet faced Octavian's admiral, Agrippa. Cleopatra commanded part of the fleet herself, but the battle turned chaotic. When her ships began to retreat, Antony followed, abandoning the fight. Octavian's forces captured what remained of their navy, and the war was lost. A year later, Octavian marched into Egypt. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, fell on his sword. Cleopatra, refusing to be paraded as a trophy in Rome, chose her own end. According to ancient accounts, she died in 30 before the Common Era, perhaps by the bite of an aspa cobra, sacred to Egyptian royalty, though some historians believe she used poison instead. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty and the last remnant of Alexander's empire came to an end. Egypt became a Roman province, ruled by governors rather than kings. The wealth of the Nile now flowed directly into Rome's coffers, feeding the empire that would dominate the next 5 centuries. Yet Cleopatra's legend did not die. The Romans, despite their victory, could not erase her image. Poets and historians turned her into a symbol sometimes of decadence and danger, sometimes of courage and grandeur. For centuries, she would remain the most famous woman of the ancient world, remembered not as the last of the Ptolemies, but as the last to stand against Rome. In her, the world of Alexander met its end, not with conquest, but with surrender to history, as the next empire. The crown that had once adorned pharaohs, Macedonian kings, and Greek conquerors now passed silently into Roman hands. The age of Hellenistic kingdoms was over, but its spirit, a blend of East and West, ambition and intellect, would shape the empire that followed. When Cleopatra died in 30 before the Common Era, it did not just mark the fall of Egypt, it marked the final closing of the age that had begun with Alexander the Great 3 centuries earlier. The kingdoms that had risen from his empire were gone, absorbed one by one into the expanding Roman world. Yet the civilization they created, the Hellenistic world, did not vanish. It transformed. Rome had conquered the lands, but it could not conquer the culture. The Roman elite spoke Latin in public, but Greek in private. Senators read Homer, studied Plato, and sent their sons to Athens to learn philosophy. Greek architects designed Roman temples. Greek physicians filled Roman cities. Greek teachers shaped Roman thought. Even the Roman gods were Greek faces. Jupiter became Zeus, Mars became Ares, Venus became Aphrodite. The scientific and artistic heritage of the Hellenistic age became the foundation of Roman civilization. The mathematics of Euclid, the astronomy of Aristotle, and the geography of Eratosthenes guided Roman engineers, sailors, and builders. The medical writings of Herophilus and Erasistratus shaped medicine for centuries. The art of the Hellenistic sculptors, their realism, emotion, and grandeur, became the standard for Roman aesthetics. But the Hellenistic legacy was more than art and science. It was the idea that cultures could mix and create something greater than themselves. Greek rationalism had merged with Egyptian mysticism, Persian kingship, and Indian spirituality. The world had become connected through trade, ideas, and language in ways no earlier civilization had achieved. That fusion lived on in Alexandria, which remained the intellectual heart of the ancient world long after the Ptolemies were gone. Its library and museum continued to attract scholars under Roman rule. Here, in the 1st century of the Common Era, Claudius Ptolemy would write his Almagest, mapping the stars and defining astronomy for the next 1,400 years. Greek texts were translated into Latin, Arabic, and later, the languages of Europe and Asia. Through this chain of transmission, the knowledge of the Hellenistic world shaped the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Golden Age, and the European Renaissance. Even beyond learning, the Hellenistic model of empire left a permanent mark. Alexander's vision of a world united through exchange, not just by conquest, became a pattern repeated by Rome, Byzantium, and the Islamic and Mongol empires centuries later. The Greek-speaking cities he and his successors founded, Antioch, Ephesus, Pergamon, and especially Alexandria, survived as vital centers of civilization deep into the Middle Ages. In Asia, traces of Hellenism endured in unexpected places. The Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara continued to influence Buddhist sculpture long after the Greek kingdoms had vanished. The trade routes of the Seleucids and Greco-Bactrians became the arteries of the Silk Road, connecting the Mediterranean with India and China. Greek coins and artistic motifs have been found thousands of kilometers east of where Alexander's campaigns ended. Silent witnesses to how far the cultural ripples of his empire spread. The story of the Hellenistic age, then, is not simply a tale of lost empires. It is the story of how a world, once divided by geography and language, became interconnected through culture. The soldiers who marched with Alexander may have fought for gold and glory, but the cities they left behind became homes for ideas, art, and science that outlasted every throne. When Rome adopted Greek learning, it ensured that the legacy of Alexander's empire would never truly die. Even as Latin became the language of power, Greek remained the language of wisdom. For the next 1,000 years, scholars, explorers, and conquerors would trace their intellectual heritage back to that extraordinary moment when a young Macedonian king crossed into Asia and remade the world. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan, from the streets of Athens to the palaces of Rome, the marks of the Hellenistic age still linger in the domes, the columns, the books, and the words that define civilization itself. The empires may have fallen, but their fusion of East and West remains alive in the modern world's art, science, and thought. 3 centuries after his death, Alexander's dream had come full circle. The map of his empire was gone, but his idea that the world could share one culture had become reality. The legacy of his successors, their triumphs and failures alike, had woven humanity's first truly global civilization. And though the kings, temples, and dynasties had turned to dust, one truth remains. The Hellenistic world never truly ended. It simply changed names. First to Rome, then to Byzantium, and finally, to the world we live in today. The great empires have fallen silent now. The marble cities stand half buried in sand. The harbors of Alexandria are quiet. The theaters of Antioch echo only with the wind. Yet their spirit endures. The language that once united scholars and merchants now whispers from old texts and scientific terms. The ideas that once crossed deserts and seas now flow through the fabric of modern thought. As you picture the ancient world fading into dusk, the Nile turning gold under a setting sun, the columns of a forgotten temple glowing faintly in the desert light, imagine the continuity that links then and now. The stars that guided Alexander's soldiers still shine above us. The geometry that shaped their temples still defines our cities. Empires rise and fall, but knowledge survives. Art survives. Curiosity survives. The same curiosity that drove Greek philosophers to study the heavens, that led traders to sail unknown waters, that inspired poets to imagine a single world. It still burns quietly within humanity. So, let the noise of history soften now. Picture the libraries, the lamps, the silent marble halls, where generations of thinkers once dreamed of order amid chaos. The past, for all its wars and ambition, left behind something peaceful, the enduring promise of understanding. You can rest in that thought. The Hellenistic world, its wisdom, its beauty, its courage, never truly vanished. It lives in every discovery, every book, every question that looks beyond borders. The story is complete, but its echo continues.